Everyone knows about Fallout's experiment vaults. Though, what if I told you that every single vault is actually secretly an experiment? Well, you might not believe me, but by the end of the video, I will convince you why. You see, Vault-Tec is the foremost builder of state-of-the-art underground Fallout shelters, vaults if you will, luxury accommodations where you can wait out the horrors of nuclear devastation. With these reassuring words, the Vault-Tec representative in Fallout 4 described to pre-selected citizens the fantastic advantages of relying on the Vault system. A vault meant protection, comfort, and a guaranteed ticket to survival in the event of a new Great War. But as all Fallout fans know, things didn't quite turn out that way. So why was every vault a human experiment? And what did Vault-Tec really want to achieve? The origins. Let's start at the beginning. Even before the Great War of 2077, the dystopian United States of the Fallout world was a very different society from the one we know. The Cold War never ended, and the atom became the country's main source of energy, powering everything from cars to weapons, from common household appliances to entire cities. This was an eternal contradiction with the fear of a nuclear war that could break out at any moment. In this climate of growing fear, need for control, and pursuit of progress at any cost, one company made its way onto the US and world stage by promising what all citizens felt they needed: security. The first information we have about the origins of Vault-Tec comes with the acquisition of Morgantown College, which was immediately renamed Vault-Tec University. It was at this institution that many of the greatest minds who would later join the scientific and executive ranks of the multinational corporation studied and taught. By exploiting the contributions and patents of the eminent minds it had cultivated at its university, the company soon managed to establish itself in a multitude of key fields: weapons, biology, evolution, new technologies, and advanced engineering. In a very short time, Vault-Tec was transforming itself into one of the largest and most powerful multinationals in the world, capable of leading and imposing its will not only on the American people, but on all of humanity. Its message was clear: only those who trust us will survive the apocalypse unscathed. The growing tension and extreme media bombardment led the population to trust them, so much so that they began a real race to try to get a place in the shelters. An entry ticket was worth more than a lottery win. It was a guarantee of survival. But what civilians did not know was that behind the solid security facade of the vaults, Vault-Tec and the Enclave were hiding a secret program: the Societal Preservation Program, a series of experiments aimed at conducting morally ambiguous tests on human beings. Thus, every vault became a laboratory and every citizen a subject of study. The Enclave. What then is the Enclave? Born well before the Great War as a secret faction within the US government, it was made up of extremely powerful and influential men and women, military officers, scientists, politicians, industrialists, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and even members of some president's executive teams. Figures capable of pulling the strings of power from behind the scenes and influencing the course of American society. A veritable shadow government with the sole purpose not of doing good for the nation, although many of its members would hypocritically claim otherwise, but of maintaining their power and personal wealth intact. So much so that they were often involved in the greatest conspiracies and secrets in US history. Their dream was genetic purity, a society rebuilt by perfect human beings, unaffected by mutations and radiation. Well before the first reports of the danger of atomic war, the Enclave was well aware of the possibility of imminent total destruction. It therefore developed a series of extreme projects aimed at preserving its own existence and that of a relatively small group of loyalists useful for the reconstruction of civilization. The first steps were the construction of isolated and highly defended structures where the group could take refuge and continue to wage war even in the event of the fall of the central government itself. Among these, the famous presidential oil rig in the Pacific Ocean was a remote installation and one of the Enclave's most important nerve centers. Then came the Safe House Project, developed in collaboration with Vault-Tec, which was useful for recovering data essential for the refounding of future society. But the Enclave's real ultimate goal was much more extreme than one might expect: the construction of a real spaceship that would serve as a multi-generational ark for the group and a selection of pure humans who would colonize a new planet, founding a society free from the corruption of mutations and radiation, and initiating human expansion towards the stars. From this perspective, failure was not an option. Failure meant condemning the last remnants of humanity, and this is where the idea of the vaults came from. Remote locations were to carry out experiments that will help future society function at its best. Despite this, things did not go as planned. The reason for this is unknown. Perhaps the ship was destroyed, perhaps they were unable to create a working version, or perhaps the project is still under construction. But the Enclave seemed to have to abandon this goal and divert its efforts and plans to the ravaged territory of the old United States, the Safe House Project. As we have said, the United States in the early 2050s is a nation on the brink of crisis. The collapse of the United Nations, the new plague, the Euro-Middle Eastern War, and the threat of an imminent Great War fought with nuclear weapons led to the development of a growing fear among the civilian population. Project Safe House was the official name chosen in 2054 by the US government to refer to the large-scale construction of underground shelters across the country that would ensure the continuity of American civilization in the event of a nuclear catastrophe. But it was also the greatest deception in the history of the Fallout world. Following an extremely aggressive advertising campaign, the dissemination of data that was as enthusiastic as it was false, and the success of the demonstration model in Los Angeles, Vault-Tec was awarded the contract to build the shelters, which were called, precisely, vaults. The president of the Enclave, Richard Moreau, who would later take the name President Eden, described the vaults as an investment in the genetic future of the United States. The government commissioned 122 shelters with the aim of protecting citizens from annihilation. But, as is often the case, the truth was quite different, and their real purpose much darker. Such a small number of vaults for such a large population meant having to choose who deserved to survive and who did not. And while ordinary citizens saw the shelters as a great humanitarian effort, only 17, the so-called control vaults, were actually designed to keep their guests safe. For Vault-Tec and the Enclave, all the others were nothing more than testing grounds for humanity. Some were programmed to carry out psychological or social experiments. Others were biological or technological, but all involved the cold sacrifice of the individual in the name of some elusive benefit to future humanity. The paradox is frightening. Vault-Tec sold the hope of salvation, but in reality turned the citizens who trusted it into calculated sacrifices, unaware of the macabre fate that awaited them. A confidential document cited in the Fallout Bible reads, "It is not enough to survive the bombs. We must learn to rebuild humanity from its ashes. And to do that, we must first destroy it methodically." The hidden function. Each vault was unique. Each had a specific purpose and was structured and stocked specifically to carry out its assigned experiment. Unfortunately, almost none of them had a beneficial purpose. The sole aim was to test the limits of human beings and their reactions to socially or morally extreme situations. Let's look at some of the most disturbing experiments carried out. Isolation experiments. Can a community survive if deprived of contact with the outside world for generations? Humans are social animals who grow and improve through collaboration with their peers. So what happens if they are deprived of this factor? In Vault 101, the original vault of the protagonist of Fallout 3, the goal was to experiment with what would happen if a small community remained completely isolated from the outside world for an indefinite period of time. No scheduled opening was planned, no possibility of an end. Residents would be kept in the dark about the truth of the outside world, possibly forever. Deprived of knowledge, the citizens of the vaults were condemned to an even worse kind of prison, a mental one. Experiments in power and hierarchy. Vaults such as number 11, perhaps one of the most emblematic, attempted to simulate extreme or anomalous power structures. In this case, the entire population was forced to vote annually. The person selected by the majority would be sacrificed to the vault's machine god. If no one was chosen, the punishment would be the extermination of all inhabitants. What was most shocking was the discovery, after a fierce internal war, of the last 5 remaining inhabitants. For the first time, they refused to choose a new sacrifice, preferring to die together rather than perpetuate this cruel demand. It was only then that the vault opened automatically, while a holodisc congratulated the survivors on their courage in choosing to sacrifice themselves rather than give in to the blackmail of killing an innocent person. Resource experiments. The founding of a new society meant having to deal with an unpredictable amount of resources, both material and psychological. Vault 34 was supplied with more than enough weapons, large recreational areas, but limited living space. Soon, the overcrowding of the shelter led to the first internal riots, and a group of rebels decided to leave for the outside world, never to return. Following this escape, the Overseer decided to seal the exit, but the riots did not stop. Soon, the remaining citizens attempted once again to take control of the vault by trying to enter the armory guarded by security guards. The attempt failed, but the attack damaged many important internal structures, including the reactor. Trapped inside the sealed vault and exposed to radiation, most of the inhabitants lost their minds and turned into ghouls. The few survivors had no choice but to wait and hope that outside help would arrive to open the vault from and free them. Technological experiments. Vault 112 was certainly the most extreme version of the concept of technological control. Designed by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, this vault, run entirely by RoboBrain, housed 85 inhabitants hibernating in pods that confined them to a virtual reality simulation. Theoretically programmed to be utopian settings in which residents could live long and peaceful lives, in reality, the entire simulation was under the complete control of Braun himself, who was also hibernating in his own pod. It is not known whether this was his original intention or whether the man went mad over time, but after a few years, Braun began torturing and killing the avatars of the vault's inhabitants, then resurrecting them in a new simulation and starting all over again, in a theoretically permanent cycle of eternal suffering, of which they were barely aware. Cultural and psychological experiments. Vault 75 is considered one of the cruelest ever created. Located beneath Malden Middle School, its official purpose was to shelter school children, teachers, and their families. When the bombs began to fall, the citizens managed to reach the shelter without any problems. But once inside, the adults were separated from the children and, unbeknownst to the latter, were massacred by security guards. From that moment on, the children were raised by subjecting them to extreme tests designed to see how far their intellectual and physical abilities could be developed through training alone. As usual, the use of fear was the key to everything. Indoctrinated with fear of what the outside world had become, they were encouraged to do their best in their training, so that one day they would be able to leave the vault and use what they had learned to rebuild society. Upon reaching the age of 18, each inhabitant had to take a final exam that would result in a diploma, and the promise of being able to begin their journey to the surface. Sadly, this too was a deception. Graduates who were not deemed worthy were simply eliminated. The most promising met the same fate, but DNA samples and organs were also taken from them for study. Instead, a small number who were considered remarkably intelligent and easily influenced were even recruited to join the future generation of scientists who would carry on the experiment. Genetic experiments. Finally, some shelters were intended to find new ways to create a superior human race capable of shaping the new world. In Vault 87, the inhabitants were enrolled in Dr. Wayne Merrick's evolutionary experimentation program and unknowingly forced to take concentrated doses of FEV, the forced evolutionary virus. The subjects soon began to show extreme symptoms. Both males and females evolved into an asexual form. The males developed extreme strength, and both gained thicker, more resistant skin. However, the experiment as a whole was a failure. The infected citizens suffered a significant decrease in their intellectual faculties, to the point that one woman died due to a collapse of her brain functions. Many others had to be suppressed, as they experienced drastic increases in anxiety and anger levels, becoming completely uncontrollable. As happened in many other vaults, it didn't take long for the situation to degenerate. Security measures proved ineffective in dealing with the extreme violence of the infected. The Overseer also tried to seal the vault, but some individuals still managed to escape. Within a year, all the inhabitants had been infected, mutating tragically and taking complete control of the shelter, leading to what is now considered the point of origin of all the super mutants on the East Coast. This new race, rendered sterile by the virus, became obsessed with its own survival and proliferation, to the point of carrying out raids on the outside world to kidnap ordinary humans, subject them to FEV, and mutate them in order to continue the species. These are just some of the many experiments carried out in the vaults, and perhaps not even the most terrible ones. Vault-Tec and the Enclave sought to discover what happens to humans when rules are taken away, when faith is manipulated, or when individuals are isolated, but essentially, the result is always the same: the loss of humanity itself. The motivations of Vault-Tec and the Enclave. But why all this? Why so much effort and billions of dollars spent to create such a perverse system? How did it come to this? There are many motivations, but essentially the main objective was to collect data that would be useful to the small human communities selected to survive and have the opportunity to rebuild a society, probably under the full control of Vault-Tec and the Enclave. The objectives of the multinational corporation and those of the secret group probably often diverged, leading to clashes and the construction of special vaults useful for the mysterious purposes of one of the two factions. However, by analyzing the information in our possession and applying a little logic and imagination, we can hypothesize that the main objectives of the study were social control, information useful for implementing an effective strategy of domination, minimizing the danger of insurrections, rebellions, and the creation of factions opposed to the hegemonic one. How is order maintained? How far can obedience be pushed? What is the limit of trust that human beings are willing to grant? The answers to these questions would have been the foundation on which the future form of government would have been built: the selection of the human race. Following the war and the bombing, the Enclave began to develop various deviant supremacist ideologies that were already present in a more or less dormant form in its philosophy. The group wanted to re-establish a pure society, free from the aberrant scourge of radiation, mutations, and moral degeneration that was rampant in post-war America. Thus, many of the experiments were based on extreme eugenic ideas aimed at developing the best possible human race, superior to the humans of the past, and suited to building a bright future world. Economic and military power. Control over wealth and technology has always been one of the keys to domination. Building shelters on behalf of the government for Vault-Tec meant not only access to a monstrous amount of public funds, but also to patents, secret technologies, and genetic and military research that were integrated into pre-existing projects, developed and reorganized for their own purposes. In fact, it was a huge leap forward for the multinational corporation's goals: entrepreneurial philosophy, taken to its extreme consequences without any scruples, philosophical cynicism, and the banality of evil. Finally, there is one last very important aspect that should not be underestimated. Most Vault-Tec scientists, perhaps indoctrinated by the company, perhaps advocates of this philosophy themselves, believed that the destruction of modern society was inevitable, and that only science was the appropriate tool to lead humanity towards a better future. Therefore, in the name of this, everything was permitted. Everything was justified. Any means was a reasonable end to achieve the goals of human survival, progress, and future refoundation. From this perspective, good and evil no longer existed. They were trite and outdated concepts. What existed, what was really important, was only the sterile necessity of scientific finalization. In the name of this, sacrificing lives was only a small price to pay: the consequences in the post-war world. When the bombs fell, the United States was transformed into a radioactive desert. Many vaults did not function as they should have. Some never opened, while others opened too soon, releasing the fruits of their experiments into the world: mutants, new human factions, and futuristic technologies that were often out of control. But paradoxically, it was precisely these strange and unexpected agents that shaped the new world. New races, such as ghouls and supermutants, are the direct result of Vault-Tec's experiments, and many of the societies that exist in the video game's contemporary world were founded by survivors who escaped from shelters such as Vault City itself. Each vault became an epicenter that, like a stone thrown into a pond, sent out ripples, a chain reaction of changes, whether positive or negative. This was probably not part of Vault-Tec or the Enclave's plans, but in part the shelters kept their promise to allow American civilization to survive, albeit often in distorted and unpredictable forms. In fact, the most disturbing part of this whole story is that, in the end, Vault-Tec won, but not from a purely economic or political point of view, but rather a conceptual one. In fact, the experiment was successful, and everything in the modern world of Fallout bears its indelible mark. Cities, factions, and individuals still live under the logic of control and survival on which the company built its shelters. In fact, in Westland, every community is nothing more than the evolution of a vault. Isolated, paranoid, armed, and ready to do anything to get ahead in the new post-apocalyptic world, almost always without any regard for the morality of their choices. In Fallout New Vegas, Mr. House says, "Humanity survived because it had no choice. Suffering was our experiment, and we learned." In fact, Vault-Tec didn't just want to study human behavior, it wanted to learn how to shape it, and it succeeded. The message of Fallout. In the end, the questions arise spontaneously. It's not so much a question of why Vault-Tec and the Enclave did it, but why do humans let them do it? Why obey blindly? Why allow themselves to be subjected to all these horrible experiments? The truth is that fear is the greatest weapon of control that exists. When humans are afraid of dying, they are willing to make any deal to survive, or even just to feel safe again. And those who can manipulate this fear have the world in their hands. From a narrative point of view, vaults are much more than just dwellings or shelters. They are metaphors, betrayed trust, a subjugated society, fear used as a weapon. Each vault reflects a different aspect of humanity: blind faith in authority, the desire for knowledge, the corruption of power, and the illusion of security. When a player enters a new vault in any chapter of Fallout, they are not simply entering a dungeon full of enemies and useful items. They are embarking on a small journey into a theory, into a possible version of the future, capable of conveying wonderful or extremely tragic visions. The point is always to ask questions, and to understand for ourselves which answers are the right ones. Fallout and Vault-Tec are in fact a great critique of today's American society and the power of large corporations. When a citizen entered the vault, they were sold a dream. In the name of this dream, they were willing to sign contracts, follow instructions, and obey. But when the doors of the shelter were closed, Vault-Tec no longer considered them human beings. They were numbers, their property, which they could dispose of as they saw fit. Every gesture, action, and word was observed, analyzed, and manipulated. The perfect representation of an illusion of freedom and security that masked a form of voluntary slavery in the belief that it was the right and sensible choice. But in the name of survival or conformity, is it really worth sacrificing one's freedom as a human being? As a message in Vault 11 states, the real test wasn't surviving. It was remembering why it was worth it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see what happened to every country's military in Fallout, click the video on the screen.